Hello, I hope everyone out there is doing well today. I've uploaded another episode of Zilog and Moto, as you can see, so I must be doing alright, I hope. What is Zilog and Moto, you ask? Well, you see this wall of games behind me here? This is roughly 80% of my 8 and 16-bit Sega collection, with the other 20% being over there, consisting of English language games from the Sega Master System, Genesis, Sega CD, and 32X, currently numbering at 877 titles or so, about 400 away from my goal of having complete libraries for each of those consoles. You could say I'm a bit of a fan, and you wouldn't be wrong. However, my goal isn't to just spend a bunch of money that would probably be better invested in real estate on old pieces of plastic and silicone. No, that would be silly and not in a good, fun way like I try to have around here. I've got bigger plans. Instead of just meticulously searching eBay and conventions for these titles so they can be cataloged, alphabetized, and collect dust, I wanted to actually do something positive with these games and set up a channel where each of the titles, good and bad, would get their day in the sun and be reviewed in depth, providing a view of the original packaging and manuals, and then the games themselves running on original hardware when possible, to get as authentic a look as you can get for these titles. Well, mine is using a CRT anyway. I'm sorry, I've played video games on CRTs for many years. I rather enjoy living in 2022 and playing video games on a giant 4K TV rather than something that might have been part of a security system 30 years ago. I don't get it, I just don't. But anyway, if weekly reviews of this collection of Sega games sounds interesting to you, I'd ask that you think about subscribing, as it will help other people see these reviews and maybe get some useful knowledge about the games that aren't Sonic the Hedgehog or Streets of Rage. Not that there's anything wrong with those two games. Hell, I gave Sonic 4 stars back in episode 100, but there's just so much out there that has been lost to time. Today's review is about a game for the Genesis, and not just any game for the Genesis, but actually one of the first two games to ever be released for the Mega Drive platform in Japan, and that would be Space Harrier II. Yes, back when the Mega Drive made its first appearance all the way back in October of 1988, the two launch titles were Super Thunderblade, that I actually just looked at a few episodes ago in episode 158, and then this title here. Honestly, I didn't plan on reviewing these two games so close together. It's just kind of the way things worked out. Similar to Super Thunderblade, Space Harrier II is also the sequel to a Sega Super Scalar series arcade title, albeit an earlier one this time, with the original Space Harrier first appearing in arcades in 1985. Space Harrier had been a major hit for Sega, and the game was popular enough to support 3 different versions of the arcade cabinet, which would provide a blueprint for later Super Scalar games to also have regular and deluxe arcade versions. Due to this popularity, Space Harrier got not one, but 2 versions of the game on the Master System, amongst ports to other non-Sega consoles, and I previously looked at the non-3D Master System version back in episode 62. But this review isn't for Space Harrier, it's for Space Harrier II. What exactly does that mean for the game, and how has Space Harrier II changed from the original arcade machine? Well, I'll go over all that and more, but first, a look at the package.
And this is my copy of Space Harrier II, looking minty fresh and clean from the outside of the package. I'm honestly glad that I ended up taking my time picking up this copy of the game, because rather than ending up with just any copy of the game, I managed to get this one particular one, which looks fantastic inside and out, as we'll get to in a minute. Very minimal scuffing and scratching to the outside cover, and the hang tab is still intact at the top of the case. As far as the inner cover goes, it's been perfectly maintained as the outer cover has done its job, with no sun bleaching, water damage, or edge wear anywhere to be seen. The cover art for Space Harrier II is iconic. And note, I didn't necessarily say good, but this art stands out when you see the game on a shelf. Personally, I like it because it's different and gives the game very much a 70s and early 80s sci-fi movie feel, which I think it was missing previously. You've got Space Harrier, and yes, that is what his name is as listed in the manual, facing forward, as opposed to what's been presented in the games where you always see his back. And while his name is still somewhat anonymous, giving him a face definitely makes the game feel a lot less like a generic shooter. Space Harrier is shown taking on 2 enemies from the game, a Ghost Armor and a Medusa, all while fighting in the checkerboard reality of the Fantasy Zone. And it's just so nice to see quality cover art in the United States, after years of Master System ugliness, that actually shows where Sega gave a damn about presentation. And honestly, it could have been even better, as like other early Mega Drive titles, Altered Beast, Super League, and Super Thunderblade, this cover actually is just a portion of the original all-over artwork that Japan got. And man, just look at that. I'm glad we got what we got, but Sega of Japan really knew what they were doing with these early Mega Drive titles, at least from an artwork perspective. Flipping over the back, and it's the classic early Genesis formatting with one large screenshot followed up by two smaller screenshots below, and they all look pretty good for the time. I like how they made sure to get shots from 3 different levels, showcasing 3 different types of enemies, as with a game like Space Harrier II, where you're essentially doing the same thing the entire game, it would have been very easy to grab 3 shots that just seemed repetitive and boring. As far as the flavor text goes, it's decent and does a good job of hyping up the relatively thin plot of the game. I do like the closing stinger though. One false move and it's the end for you and Fantasyland. Dun dun dun. Opening up the package, and I've got the cartridge and a manual that is just as well preserved as the outside of the box, so I'm going to assume this copy just sat in someone's collection unplayed for a very long time. The manual is so crisp it looks almost direct from the factory. Inside it reads like a traditional Sega manual, with a brief intro and then a how-to for playing the game, complete with plenty of screenshots. I especially like how they went the extra mile and not just included each of the 12 standard levels, but then also included graphics straight from the game for each of the enemies and bosses that you'll be up against. Previously, in Master System manuals, this might have been art rather than screen captures, and that's cool too, but I really like how these show off the 16-bit power of the Genesis when it comes to sprite art. Okay, that's the nicely maintained package. Let's get into Space Harrier II itself and discuss the game and its relation to the original. Before I get directly into the review, I want to raise a question that some of you might be asking. Why a sequel rather than a direct port? That's a good question, and I think there's a couple possible reasons. The first reason is an obvious one, but I believe Sega was attempting to not compete with themselves. What I mean by that is that both Thunderblade and Space Harrier were ported already to the Master System, and for those that had already purchased those titles, Sega wanted to make gamers think that they were different enough from those ports as to purchase these new versions, and in turn support the brand new console. Keep in mind that early on in the Genesis lifespan, the power-based converter that allows you to play Master System games on your Genesis was very much promoted by Sega as a way to enhance players' game libraries. If a player already had a copy of Thunderblade or Space Harrier sitting on their shelf that they could now play on their Genesis via the PBC, they probably wouldn't be inclined to purchase the same game again. Or at least that was the thinking at the time, as keep in mind this was in the days before remaster after remaster caused players to rebuy the same game 3 times on 3 different consoles. I'm looking squarely at you, Grand Theft Auto V and The Last of Us. But then, there's also a less obvious reason. By making these games sequels, if there were limitations to what the Genesis could do with the ports of the games, this could very easily be explained by saying that they were different games. And with them being different games, it made sense for them not to match up exactly to the arcade versions that players might have been expecting. Now, maybe that seems a little conspiracy theory-ish, but it makes sense for Sega to give themselves that out, especially with first-generation software, right? Regardless of Sega's own reasoning, Space Harrier at the time was popular enough that third parties were going to jump at the chance to milk the name again. The original Space Harrier had been a massive success both in arcades and at home, with ports to almost every active platform at the time. Seriously, go look at the Moby Games page for Space Harrier. You have to get pretty obscure to find a console or computer that you couldn't play the original Space Harrier on. When Space Harrier II was released for the Genesis, Grand Slam Entertainment in the UK jumped in and published all sorts of similar ports to the various European-based home computers. For what was technically a home game only, assuming you didn't count it appearing in arcades via Sega's Megatech system, this was somewhat unusual, although I think the Mega Drive's delayed release in PAL regions probably had something to do with this as well. So what exactly is Space Harrier II then? Is it merely a ripoff of the original arcade machine, but with slightly different options and features that attempt to differentiate itself from the original enough to merit giving it a sequel number? In a word, yes. In fact, I would say it's even more similar to the original Space Harrier than Super Thunderblade is to Thunderblade, which I suppose should be expected with Thunderblade being a more advanced original title. Now, all that probably sounds bad, and I'm sure there's going to be plenty of people looking back on this and thinking Sega made questionable choices here, but thankfully, the end result game is one that certainly deserves to exist, no matter what you call it. To put things plainly, Space Harrier II very much resembles the original Space Harrier at first glance, but Sega did try to make some tweaks to the game to try to give it some distance from the original. One of those changes is that now Space Harrier II is a shorter game, at least in number of levels. The original Space Harrier featured 18 levels, and now Space Harrier II only has 12, not counting the final level. This might seem like Sega has considerably pared things down, in an attempt to be more economic with the game fitting in 4 megabits of cartridge space, which, by the way, was double the 2 megabits used on the original Master System release. And that would be correct, but believe it or not, having less content isn't necessarily a bad thing here, as bananas as that might sound in 2022. While the original Space Harrier arcade game did feature 18 levels, not counting bonus levels, there was some content overlap going on. You ended up with certain levels that looked similar to each other, with similar looking backgrounds, items in the background, and enemies that were maybe just palette swap versions of enemies in other levels. This combined with the fact that the gameplay never changes, makes slogging through 18 levels of action possibly a bit of a chore unless you absolutely love the game. This works and makes sense in the arcade as, let's face it, arcade shooters at the time weren't really designed to give the player some deep, enriching experience, they were designed to be quarter munchers. The more levels included in the game, the more quarters a player is going to pop in to attempt to make it to the end of the game, especially as the original Space Harrier supports continuing right from where you lost a life. For a console game in general, you don't want anything included that feels like just padding or needlessly extending the game. Maybe your only choice at the pizza parlor or skating rink is Space Harrier, but chances are, if you're playing at home, you've got plenty of other choices to pop in if something is feeling a bit boring or long. In the case of Space Harrier II, the end result is a game that's a bit more focused, while still having plenty of action for the player, and that's a good thing. Along with having fewer levels, Space Harrier II changes a few other things around with the structure of the game. Now, rather than having to go from the first level to the last in order, you can pick which of the first 12 areas that you start from, and then proceed in order. So for instance, if you decide you want to start on level 4, the goal would be to play through levels 4 through 12, and then back down to 1, 2, and 3 before finally hitting that final level.
Get ready.
I like this a lot for a few reasons. One, it adds a nice bit of variety to the game, as no longer are you expected to trudge through the first few levels every time you play, giving each playthrough a different feel if you so choose. Also, this is very useful as each level has different sets of enemies and bosses with different attack patterns, and it's pretty hard to say practice or get some experience with what to do in level 4 if you keep using all of your lives to get through levels 1 through 3. I could definitely see scenarios with the original Space Harrier on the Master System where most players never saw any of the content on the later levels simply because they weren't good enough to get there, like me. And having this open level choice at the beginning of the game really serves to open the game up and make it more accessible to players. However, beyond these good reasons I've listed for having less levels and the other changes that have been made in the game, there's also another tweak that players may not appreciate so much. And that's the removal of continues. Now, I'm not sure why Sega thought this was a good idea, but I can only assume that they thought with the game having less overall content, that perhaps players wouldn't need the continues anymore. This is not the case. At least for me anyway. Maybe the Space Harrier masters out there don't have a problem with it. But from my perspective, the game could certainly have benefited from the standard 3 continue system. To put it bluntly, like Space Harrier before it, Space Harrier II is not an easy game, if you're looking to eventually roll credits. I wouldn't call it unfair necessarily, but it's definitely challenging, even if you change the options to set the mode to easy and turn on rapid fire. By the way, the rapid fire option is an absolute must unless you have your own rapid fire controller, so good on Sega for including that in a game. Not exactly a lot of options to let you deal with that otherwise for a launch title in 1989. Part of what makes Space Harrier II so difficult is a similar problem to what plagues Super Thunderblade, and that's a much lower frame rate in-game due to the Genesis not supporting sprite scaling natively in hardware, as opposed to the original arcade boards. They were called the Super Scaler series for a reason after all. With the arcade version of Space Harrier, you had more advanced warning of when something was coming at you due to the better frame rate, and being better able to see either projectiles, enemies, or background objects heading your way. Again, I wouldn't specifically call it unfair, but it definitely takes some getting used to and practice with the levels. Also, one thing I want to be very clear about, you may have noticed that I've referenced Super Thunderblade a lot in this review in conjunction with Space Harrier II. And if you saw my review of Super Thunderblade, you'd know that that isn't a good thing, as I don't have the highest opinion of Super Thunderblade, to put it mildly. But Space Harrier II is not Super Thunderblade. While both games were developed internally by Sega at R&D 2, it was clearly not the same programmers working on both games, as while Super Thunderblade is a choppy, pitiful mess, Space Harrier II is a beautiful effort that was clearly pushing the limits of the bleeding edge technology it was running on. I briefly mentioned how good the sprite work in the game is during the manual segment, and as good as those pictures look in the manual, it doesn't do the in-game graphics justice, if you can believe that. Everything is drawn so incredibly well that I don't know how they managed to fit this game into 4 megabits. And even though the action isn't as smooth as the arcade original, things still zoom around very quickly, with the floors and ceilings giving a great sensation of speed. Also, one of the things that the arcade version was known for was its use of a bright, trippy color palette to keep things from getting boring visually, and I can honestly say that the full use of the Genesis ability to display colors is on display here, something that I did not expect. With as good as the graphics are, I've got to be honest, I was a little let down by the sound.
Get ready.
The music isn't bad per se, but I do feel like the synths used are a bit simple. It just doesn't have that punch that I know the Genesis is capable of and have heard in other games. I've got a feeling that probably some of that is due to needing to reserve room for the graphics assets, and with it being a launch title, I'm trying to grade it on a bit of a curve here, but it's still just kind of to me. The sound effects fare a bit better, and I appreciate including the "Get Ready" and Space Harrier's death cry to spice things up a bit. All told, Space Harrier II is almost the perfect launch title, and is a huge step up from other launch ports like Altered Beast and Super Thunderblade. This is the game you want to put on display versus your friend's NES in late 1989 to show off just what 16-bit power means. After playing it this week, it made so much more sense as to why it's hard to find, because it's actually a good game and people want to hold on to it. As a result, I'm giving Space Harrier II 3 stars, because Sega didn't hit a lead-off home run here, but this is definitely a solid triple. Actually, that probably would have made more sense to go in the Tommy Lasorda baseball review, but whatever. Space Harrier II isn't going to win you over if you didn't like the arcade game, but if you did, this was as good as it gets at home in the late 80s.
Okay, that was Space Harrier II for the Genesis. One of the ways that I know I'm playing a good game is when I'm playing a title that's difficult, and Space Harrier II is difficult, and yet I'm still impressed by it, and I want to continue to play it even though I know I'm unlikely to finish it without lots and lots of practice. And I get that this level of difficulty isn't going to be for everyone, but for fans of arcade shooters, this is going to be right up your alley. And hell, you may even make fun of me for thinking it's hard, who knows. Playing the game for the first time this week was definitely a highlight, and that's something that I certainly cannot say about a lot of these titles. Tune in next week as I'm reviewing a game that I can probably play blindfolded. Okay, maybe I'm not that good at it, but I've probably put more hours into this game than any other game in this entire library. I'm very excited to finally get to review this one, seeing as how its soundtrack leads off each and every one of these reviews. I'd say that if it wasn't for this game and Revenge of Shinobi, things might have turned out a lot different for me. I like this game so much that I remember distinctly being annoyed that a key feature of this game was changed in the sequel due to how much I liked this specific game, even though the sequel itself is essentially a perfect game. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Please think about subscribing if you're so inclined, and remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later!